sort of uh, practical questions about advocacy and how to influence the work that electeds do. But thank you so much for that intro. And much of my work, I would have to say, and that of the past couple of years, and I've got 3 more years left in the assembly. So the work that I'll be doing over the next few years is in alignment with the Sierra Club's priorities. Climate resilience in particular will continue to be a focus of mine. My district, the 22nd Assembly District in San Mateo County, is the most impacted district in the state from a property value standpoint, because my district includes the Bayside, where many of these companies and we have infrastructure that's in the inundation zone on the Bayside, but I also have a big coastal portion to my district, Pacifica, down through El Granada. So I'll continue to be focusing on that. Climate change, I don't need to tell all of you, it's here. It's not something out in the distant future. We're seeing that play out with sea level rise, as I described, flooding, more frequent droughts. We're thrilled that we're finally getting some rain here. Hopefully it's a good October to start us off in this rainy season. But we're seeing the longer, more frequent droughts, warmer temperatures, fire seasons that are really year-round kinds of events now. And I'm a California lifer. It's never been like this, where you have fires across the state pretty much year-round. So protecting our planet and the environment from the impacts of climate change is one of the great challenges of our time, if not the greatest. Climate change affects everything we do. It is real, it's happening now, which is why we have to act with urgency. So addressing climate change will continue to be a priority for me and a number of our folks in the Environmental Caucus. The state has shown real leadership in this area. I would argue, proud to have played a role in that. AB 825 was mentioned, the creation of it's now been branded as one Shoreline, but the San Mateo County Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. We expanded the scope of that district's work to include sea level rise and flooding on a regional level. It's the only special district of its kind dealing with sea level rise west of the Mississippi. I still haven't found the district east of the Mississippi, but we know we're doing good work here in San Mateo County in particular. The Climate Resiliency Bond, it's a $7 billion bond that I have authored for a number of years now. Because we're in a surplus situation, and we got some really good fiscal news, as a matter of fact, just yesterday, that we're going to continue to be in a budget surplus situation. Instead of going to the ballot with a bond, we're actually spending money in the budget on climate resilience. So $3.7 billion over 3 years. It's really, frankly, a modest down payment, but it still represents the largest state level investment in climate resilience anywhere in the country. But there's so much more to be done on that. But the 3.7 billion, if I could just delineate that for you, it's dealing with extreme heat, sea level rise, and other climate impacts. Examples of investments would include urban greening projects, grants to support community resilience centers, and projects to offset the urban heat island effect, which I bet some of you on this call know much more about than I do. We also offered some companion legislation to encourage regional climate adaptation planning, and that the language of that bill was folded into this climate resilience package. So it's all part of a $15 billion climate package that the legislature and the governor have put into place. It's the largest state level investment in climate happening anywhere in the country. Other parts include 1.5 billion for wildfire and forest resiliency, 5 billion for water and drought resiliency, $1 billion to support climate smart agriculture, and almost $4 billion for zero emission vehicle deployment. So along with addressing our climate crisis, California is a leader on efforts to phase out the use of fossil fuels, protect our environment, and support the health of every Californian. This includes ending the issuance of new fracking permits by 2024, moving the state toward phasing out oil extraction by 2045, and reduce demand for oil by ending the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035. And just today, I'm sure some of you have heard the governor announced some proposed regulations that would prohibit new wells and facilities, oil facilities, within a 3,200 foot exclusion area, or more commonly known as setbacks, from homes, schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and other sensitive locations. And for some, this is certainly not enough. It doesn't go fast enough. It doesn't go far enough. And that is where you all come into play as advocates. And I've discussed so far that, this did not happen in a vacuum. The things I've listed for you, it didn't happen overnight. Every step of the way, there were advocates like yourselves pushing for these things. This wasn't a creation of the legislature. We very much were partnering with outside organizations like the Sierra Club in terms of advocacy. The advocates, they come to us early and develop a relationship with the policymaker and the staff. Effective advocates are proactive as opposed to reactive. It's always effective to work as part of a coalition. Some of this may sound really straightforward, but believe me, some of these basics really come into play when you're trying to move a big package like the climate resiliency package. It's always better to work as part of a group as opposed to a singular organization. This lets policymakers like myself know this is an issue that others care about too. And there really is a political dimension to this, I have to say. When we're working on our bond, for example, I know that ultimately this could very well go to the ballot. And we're going to need a coalition of groups that have, that have mailing lists, that have tentacles, they have networks, they have ways to reach people who care about these issues. Because not only do we have to get some of this through the legislature, we actually have to get it passed at the ballot. And that really adds another element there. And if people are going to vote for something that's going to go to the ballot, they want to know that it will actually pass when it goes to the ballot. And that's where advocacy organizations like the Sierra Club are absolutely crucial. So continue to have conversations and open dialogue with elected officials and staff throughout the legislative process, from soup to nuts, from the beginning of the process to completion. Elected officials, as you might suspect, have to balance lots of competing interests, listen to lots of competing viewpoints, take constructive feedback, and don't think or speak ill of the member or the staff if they are not on board right away. My old mentor, not my old mentor, or she wouldn't like me saying that. My mentor, when I was a staffer, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who held the office that I hold now, she likes to say, hey, keep your powder dry. It's really basic, but somebody may not be with you immediately, but you can get to them over time. They can become your ally ultimately. So be thoughtful and strategic before you burn a bridge with any elected or anybody in the arena. Be willing to compromise. Politics is the art of compromise. I think it was Bobby Kennedy liked to say, politics is the art of the possible. I mean, that's really what it is. Is it possible to cobble together a variety of ideas into a package, work the politics, work the public sphere, and actually get something done in a meaningful way? Sometimes what you are advocating for isn't possible for a variety of reasons. You may not get everything you want, but you may still get some of what you want. And this is my 8th year in the legislature now, and I could tell you with personal experience here that you rarely get everything you want. You rarely get the perfect package or perfect bill. You always get a portion, and sometimes you get nothing. But there has to be a willingness to give and take, even if incrementalism is frustrating. If you make a number of positive incremental steps, it can add up to something very meaningful. But I know it requires patience. I would say resilience, personal resilience, and ultimately persistence really is so key to everything you do as an advocate, as somebody who's advocated for a variety of things in my life, but who's somebody who's on the receiving end of advocacy efforts, persistence really does matter. And a sense that, hey, these folks are not going to go away until they see some real progress. It actually matters. And I would encourage you to channel that passion into persistent efforts to see something happen. So often an incremental approach results in building trust that will lead ultimately to a sweeping change. But patience and focus, resilience, persistence, those are all keys. Just something to keep in mind. But I would love to learn a little bit more. I think I'll wrap there and allow plenty of time for questions here. Just a little bit about who is on this call, how you folks came to do the work that you do, how I could do my job better, and any questions you might have about ways to effectively advocate when talking to elected officials at all levels. I'm a state official now, but I was on a city council, as James mentioned in the intro. So I know politics from the grassroots level up, and I was a staff member too. And the staff, many of these staff take these meetings with advocacy organizations. You don't always get to the elected member. So there's also sort of some nuances there in terms of communicating with staff versus the elected official that I could talk a little bit about too. But that was a little bit of a quick and dirty overview of just the highlights of what we're doing in Sacramento and the importance that I place on the work that you all do as advocates, but would be more than happy to entertain any questions or thoughts or anything that's on your mind tonight.
So I have one question, just to give you a little idea where people are coming from. This is a group of 3 different chapters of the Sierra Club. So that includes the chapters that surround the San Francisco Bay. And so in addition to just trying to educate about the wildlife and the value of the Bay, we've also studied 3 case studies where there's development or things happening on the Bay shore that we may not support. Looking at development in East Palo Alto was one of our case studies. Looking at Point Malate in Richmond, which is proposed for doing some condominium development versus remaining open space. And then we'll also look at Mare Island and some things going on there. So far we have focused on very local activism, writing to city council members, in one case writing to the East Bay Regional Park District Board of Directors about preserving Point Malate as a East Bay Regional Park. So, and then what we'd like to do at the end of the course is kind of give people an idea of the complexity of looking at these issues regionally, looking at sea level rise regionally, looking at how do we build levees, because levees one place affect levees other places. How do we make sure that the fact that sea levels are rising and there is more land is affected upland as time goes on. And so I don't know if you have an idea of, it seems like there's a lot of things going on very locally, that there is not a regional entity that's really on top of things. I don't know how you view that situation.
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a lot to sort of chew on there. BCDC, Bay Conservation Development Commission, is tasked with looking at the Bay in a regional context. They do a number of enforcement kinds of things around the Bay, but their charter, their role is going to be increasingly important because of the very regional nature of this sea level rise, bay level rise challenge. And you made the comment about building a levee in one city affects down bay cities. You're absolutely right. Foster City is a city in my district, and on one hand, I applaud them for being active in dealing with their issues. Foster City has a unique set of issues, but essentially they're taxing themselves to build a levee. But the reality is we need to be looking at the Bay in its entirety, and what the impacts are in adjoining cities north and south of them. And that's where, the one shoreline, this is a collaborative among the cities in San Mateo County. I don't know if the one shoreline resiliency district, it's pretty unique the way it's established. It's the first of its kind on the West Coast, but I'm sure other areas around the Bay are looking at one shoreline and working on some plans to develop, countywide collaboratives that deal with sea level rise, just because it really is forcing a regional conversation because of the sort of dynamics you're describing. It certainly doesn't hurt to reach out to your local city council members, but each of those cities will have a representative to BCDC because they touch, their city touches the Bay. And this really is it's like the quintessential regional issue. So, MTC primarily deals with transportation issues, but really you can't be talking about transportation infrastructure or housing development or other kinds of development without there being an interface with BCDC and the other sort of regional players. So I would say maybe sort of step back and be talking about these things in a regional way. There's a growing recognition of really the enormous challenge we have on all the Bayside communities that ring the Bay. So it's not as though you're coming in cold. If these are policymakers, they are worried about this issue just like you are. I think it's not as though you're really having to educate from a cold start. I mean, if you're in politics and you're in government and you are in a Bayside community, you are grappling with these issues right now. This is a very real challenge whenever you're talking about any kind of a development that's even approaching the inundation zone. You have to be thinking about all of those impacts. So thinking in a regional context most certainly is relevant in this on these issues.
Could I ask a follow-on question to your explanation? So BCDC has a legislative mandate that extends, I believe, 100 feet above the mean high water line, which is not very far. And as over the next couple of decades, or towards the end of the century, as the water rises, the water has to find places to go, or the marshes have to migrate upland as the marshes get inundated in order to keep the bay ecology alive, to keep a bay that's alive. So do you, as a legislator, do you think that our best approach would be to change BCDC's mandate slightly from a legislative point of view so that they have an expanded mandate? Is legislation basically what is needed in order to allow for a regional, overview? Because cities can only affect their own, and counties can only affect their own area. BCDC is the only one that circles the whole bay. Do you feel that a legislative solution is ultimately what's needed? And if that's so, what's the best way that you would see to get there?
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question, and it's one that is being contemplated. I actually serve on a budget subcommittee that has oversight over BCDC. We essentially fund BCDC, and I called for an audit of BCDC. I was concerned about some of the sort of variances in how they were doing enforcement. They're great people at BCDC. There were just some issues, sort of practical day-to-day issues. But what was sort of at my effort was, we need BCDC to really be on firm footing with the public There needs to be a real sense of confidence at the work that BCDC is doing, because as your question infers, there will probably be a move to expand BCDC's powers because we do have to look at this in a regional context. But I have to tell you, that is not an easy proposition, as you might suspect. There will be tension. As a former city council member, I know that there was tension when the city felt that we were being sort of dictated to by a regional entity. You see the same tension on housing issues, for example. Now that I'm a state official, we're really pushing cities on affordable housing development to try to deal with the affordability crisis in the Bay Area. And there's lots of tension between the locals and the state coming in saying you have to do this. But I really think you're touching on something that is really sort of inevitable, but I don't think it happens right away. I think BCDC would have to proceed with caution if they were advocating for an expansion of their powers. But I almost think it's inevitable that you're going to see sort of, and this is really big picture, but power sort of devolving from Sacramento to the regional level. And in some contexts, power moving up from the very local level to the regional level. So I think you are going to see more power invested in regional entities to deal with sea level rise, to deal with housing. You see it with some of the planning on transportation infrastructure and housing already. But if I had to look at a trend line over time, there will be more power invested in regional entities. And that would start with a legislative fix, because these are creatures of state law. So there would have to be some state changes there. So you touch on something very relevant. I don't see anything immediate in that regard, but I think it's probably inevitable that we have that conversation.
Thank you. I find it interesting that you do find it inevitable. Other questions from people? Oh, Kate Kennedy has her hand up. Do you want Kate, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
You need to unmute yourself, yes.
Hi, I don't think I had my hand up. Sorry about that.
Oh, never mind. Okay. Anyone else?
We do have some questions in the chat here that we could read out.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Read them out, Dash.
Sure. I guess I'll start. This is from, well, first of all, Chip, I'm going to read your statement. If you want to read it yourself, feel free to raise your hand or cut me off. Otherwise, I'll read it for you. This is more of a statement. He said, Mr. Mullen, we need attention and help in addressing sea level rise in the context of SF Bay shoreline contamination from many historical dumps, municipal landfills, industrial sites past and present, and of course, many contaminated sites within tidal influence of the SF Bay. This is currently not adequately addressed by cleanup decisions of the state DTSC and RWQCB and US EPA.
Can I just say,
Department of Toxics.
yeah, I know that that's a statement, but I could not agree more. And just in my hometown of South San Francisco, Oyster Point, there's a major issue around subsidence. I hope I'm saying that word properly. We've got some experts on the call. You folks study these issues and are passionate about these issues, but I see this as a huge price tag. There's a huge challenge that we have. I'm just looking at one community, my hometown, South San Francisco, the industrial city. There is a history of industrial activities on the Bayfront, where many of the biotech companies are now located. There's a legacy toxics issue, and this is just one community. It's, as you suggest, it's happening around the Bay. I really think, and thankfully, we've got a budget surplus that we're looking at. We actually were able to do quote unquote members requests where we fund different projects within our district because of the surplus tax revenue. But the reality is this problem is so large, it really exceeds anything we could do from an individual member perspective. I think there's like a $50 million price tag just on this one section of Oyster Point in South San Francisco. So you're talking about federal resources, you're talking about state resources. There's a real urgency here. I remain hopeful that we will get some federal assistance, because this really is, you're dealing with the magnitude of the issue, and you're dealing with the health of the Bay. The Bay is our primary resource in this area. It's why the Bay Area is quote unquote prosperous. That Bay is the jewel of this region from an economic and obviously environmental standpoint. So there's a recognition here amongst certain policymakers, but I think you do point to the fact that this isn't getting nearly enough attention from the powers that be, and we really do need federal help in this regard, because we're just not going to be able to come up with the dollars at either the state, regional, or local level. This is a huge deal. I know my Congresswoman Jackie Spear is fighting for money for the Bay. I'm fighting for money on wetlands restoration, but you can't ignore the toxics piece of this. It's a huge deal. And that issue alone could be a huge undertaking for the Sierra Club to be a leading voice on that issue and hold policymakers' feet to the fire. So I'll do what I can to help at the state level, but that really is a major concern that you're rightly speaking to.
There's a good question from Marsha. Marsha, do you want to speak up?
Sure. So, Assemblyman Mullen, you had said that you think that there is a difference and there are nuances between speaking to your assembly, your elected official, and their staff. And I've had experience, on advocacy days with various organizations, and you show up and you're with your peers, and you don't know whether it's going to be the staff person or the elected, and often it is the staff people. So I just wanted you to elaborate on your tips on that, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll keep it real simple, and I'll say this as a former staff member. I always appreciated it when, even if my member, the elected, couldn't meet with the group was treating the staff member with respect. I've been on the receiving end of, oh, well, we can't meet with the member. I guess we have like the junior staff member here. And you can tell the body language that they're disappointed they didn't talk to the member directly, and they're sort of mailing it in. The reality is that staff member has more power than many people think in terms of filtering information to the member. Members, I'll just speak as a member now. I feel obligated to and welcome the input of my staff, but I really I'm relying on them heavily because of all the contacts they have with people that I can't personally reach. That staff member can decide to brief the member at length on an issue, or put a blurb in a staff report. And that's a huge difference in terms of what the member then puts a weight upon. So it's really just, this is kind of like really basic stuff, I guess, but always treat the staff people with respect, even if you can't get to the member. And as a member, we try to get to as many folks as possible, but just the reality of the situation is I'll be pulled into 2 different committees at the same time, and physically can't be in the office to meet with a group when they show up. So oftentimes you will have a staff member, but you never know who you're talking to, and those folks could very well be elected officials someday. So the relationship, all the relationship building stuff that I referred to, it all matters when you're dealing with staff. So sounds pretty straightforward and simple, but still an important reminder, I guess.
Thank you.
Well, there are some other questions in the chat. Well, let's see. Dash, you had a question about a new climate adaptation strategy. Do you want to go ahead?
Oh yeah, sure. I recently got notified that the Newsom administration has released the draft 2021 climate adaptation strategy. I was wondering, if you had any early thoughts on what you think the scope of this would be or how it could affect any other ongoing state or local initiatives.
Well, look, I'm glad you alerted me to that because we're knee deep in climate adaptation strategy and dealing with the Newsom administration, but I don't have the benefit of reading that. So I will read through that. I can tell you in our contacts with the Newsom administration, they care about this issue. I candidly was frustrated at their reticence to engage in a meaningful way on the funding package until like really the very end of session. And then it became apparent that they were supportive of what we were doing. But it's sort of a note of caution, I guess. This climate adaptation, the climate resilience package and the adaptation piece is important part of that. It's a 3-year package. So I'm always nervous until the money is in the bank, so to speak, that if the fortunes of the state change, for example, the Newsom administration could come and say, you know what, we've got to revise that climate investment in years 2 and 3. We're in a surplus situation, so I'm hopeful that not only can we maintain the funding in years 2 and 3, but that we can actually build upon it because, we're not even dealing in the right scope here. My county, San Mateo County, is $24 billion with a B, $24 billion at risk with sea level rise. Yet we're sort of touting a $15 billion statewide package. So we are talking about modest down payments. We have to do so much more. And there has to be a climate piece to the federal package. I'm very nervous about what I'm hearing on that front. I mean, if we can ever get this when Democrats have the White House and both houses, we have to do something now on this in a major way, because I fear that there's this 2-year window is evaporating on us. But I will dig in on the latest that Newsom put out. I think we're going to continue to advocate for really incentivizing other regions around the state to do what the Bay Area is already doing. We really are ahead of the game compared to many, many regions around the state. We don't have it perfect here, but we are doing a lot of things in terms of the planning and preparation for sea level rise and other climate impacts. And we're hoping that other regions around the state follow suit.
Well, Regina has sort of it's a follow-on question, or you may have already answered it, but Regina, do you want to go ahead? You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Maybe it was answered. I was wondering if there was a committee of the Bay Area representatives that address the whole Bay and the issues, because that has some clout. It seems like various municipalities, cities around the Bay have initiated building projects that really threaten the health of the whole Bay. So are any of our representatives in Sacramento banded together to develop a plan that supersedes individual communities?
Yeah, great question. And the closest thing we have among Sacramento representatives, state representatives, is the Bay Area Caucus. The Bay Area Caucus are the assembly members and the senators who represent areas in the 9-county Bay. And we're smaller than our LA counterparts and other areas of the state, but we meet regularly and we are pretty much all more or less in political alignment. So we actually have power as a group in terms of like state budget decisions, for example. But in terms of sort of nuts and bolts issues, development issues around the Bay, BCDC really is the focal point. And I think it speaks to the earlier question about sort of BCDC's charter, BCDC standing in the region, abilities to really, make sure that we are taking all of these sea level rise impacts into account when any kind of a plan, any kind of planning of a development is even contemplated. There's just so much attention and focus now, more than I've ever seen, with some of the new funds, Measure AA, just some of the really remarkable work being done around the Bay. So there's a heightened sensitivity, a heightened awareness. But BCDC, I think, may be sort of sleepy for the public in terms of this regional entity, not sure exactly what it does. I think it will be even more of a political focal point moving forward, as well it should, given the import of the issues at hand.
A quick question. You mentioned the Bay Area Caucus, Assemblymember Mullen. Is that is that sort of a group that has its own staff, or do you pool resources and come together occasionally, or how does that work?
Yeah. So we come together monthly, and the staff, we don't have an independent staff person. It's usually the chair and the vice chair, their staffs will make sure that everybody's being communicated to. We will do sign-on letters together, advocate for certain projects that we believe have a real regional import, mostly budget-related issues. And Phil Ting was central in forming the latest iteration here of the Bay Area Caucus. I think there were some informal organizations in the past, but we've sort of formalized the role of the Bay Area Caucus. Nancy Skinner, my good Senate colleague from the East Bay, chairs from the Senate side. So it's bicameral. It used to be bipartisan when we actually had a Republican, Catherine Baker. We no longer have that Republican, so we can no longer say bipartisan, but it is bicameral and it's region-wide, and certainly an organizing entity at the Capitol when we're fighting for dollars and we're fighting for regional issues. But for example, your idea about might there be a expanded BCDC charter, something like that would come right to us as a Bay Area Caucus for discussion. And we have an annual retreat where we hear from regional representatives about emerging issues affecting the Bay and affecting the region. So it's a good venue to make sure that these issues are getting the attention of your state representatives. I would imagine the congressional membership has something like that. I've not heard of a congressional Bay Area caucus exactly, but I'd be shocked if there weren't at least an informal grouping and occasional meetings of the congressional members that represent the Bay region as well.
Well, I think we have time, maybe Susan, for one last question. Bill Hudson had sort of an overview question. Bill, do you want to speak up? You need to unmute yourself.
I just was wondering, from your point of view, where public opinion is on these kinds of issues and these kinds of and organizations like the Sierra Club, is there a shifting there? Are younger people, different than the older people? Just how is, how is, from your perspective, how is that sort of world looking and developing?
Yeah, well, let me say, I've never been more hopeful in terms of the public awareness, especially our young people. I mean, I get lobbied by the youth climate lobby. I spoke to a rally in Central Park in San Mateo of dozens and dozens, it could have been hundreds of young people coming out on a Saturday afternoon to let their voice be heard on climate. I mean, the climate change issue generally, global warming, has absolutely activated young people. So you're seeing a whole cadre of young activists, and it gives me hope. I turned 51 in June. I've been in this political game longer than I'd like to admit, over 25 years now, starting with Jackie Spear as a junior assembly aide. I've never seen this kind of attention on an environmental issue. We are sort of ground zero with the bay level issues, sea level rise issues. This has become a generational thing, but really, if you look at the major movements and changes, social and otherwise, it often starts with young people, and not to discount the work of those older and middle-aged folks who are crucial in mentoring and educating young people about how to be effective. Some of you, I imagine, have sort of been through the wars in your own communities about this issue and that issue, what worked and what didn't work. It's invaluable information to transmit to our younger people who are just cutting their teeth in political advocacy. So there really is an intergenerational opportunity here in this region, this progressive, open-minded, thoughtful, caring region where you have generations coming together to say, we've got to lead the state on this issue, we've got to lead the country on this issue, lead the world on this issue. We really have that opportunity, I think, and the resources to do so if channeled properly.
Well, there are a few more detailed questions, but if anyone has sort of a more general question, or you or Assembly Member Mullen, hearing you speak from the heart, and from your experience, and you obviously care about being effective and taking care of so many things. Do you have any words of wisdom for us, as we're the Sierra Club, and we sometimes are considered the opposition to everything? Do you have any words of wisdom as to how we can be more effective?
Well, what I would say is that the Sierra Club is absolutely effective. I would say be more of a partner on affordable housing issues when you can. This affordability crisis is huge. I see it happening in my district. We in Sacramento get beat up on housing issues when we take votes, tough votes. Development has to be done in the right way, in a smart way. But we've got a middle class exodus. The numbers bear that out, unfortunately, in the Bay Area. I think if there's a way, I would, and feel free to pitch this advice over the side if you don't agree with it. This is just me, as somebody who's been in the game a long time, talking. Be viewed as an advocate on economic issues as well, and middle class and service worker issues, people trying somehow to stay in the Bay Area and not leave. Be known as one of the groups that are helping lower income individuals, and environmental justice obviously is at the core of what you folks care about. All those things matter. We have to work in a collaborative way in this Bay Area of ours to maintain the vitality, maintain the quality of life. And if there's a way to sort of channel the energy and passion around sea level rise, yet also deal with economic dislocation and the shrinking middle class and the challenges that lower wage workers have. My Bay Area Caucus colleagues and I have brutal discussions around cost of living, because these funding formulas don't take into account the cost of living in the Bay Area. This has been like a generational challenge for us because we're viewed as a wealthy area. But you all know there are pockets of poverty in this region, And it just is really, really, truly difficult for people who are on the margins to stay here in this gorgeous place we call home. So to the extent that you might be able to frame things as you get it, you understand the challenges, economic challenges that people have. If there's a way to sort of frame in the language that gets used by the Sierra Club, that might help. But believe me, your brand is a good one. And it's my association with the group is one I'm deeply proud of. And you've got real power just in the organization that you represent, and sort of know that power, know the power you have, but be willing to partner with these other advocacy organizations to amplify your power. I think that could be extraordinarily helpful as we deal with these things in a regional way.
So I noticed Adriana has a question.
Hi, yes. Thank you. Hi, Assemblymember Kevin Mullen. My name is Adriana. I work for Nuestra Casa in East Palo Alto, mental justice and housing. But I am a resident of San Mateo, and I just found out that Gavin Newsom signed a law to push for or ban gas-powered leaf blowers by 2024, move more for electric. Although, like, I think, it's great that, that we are moving in that direction to a certain degree because of health concerns and also concerns to the environment. I'm also this law and a bit frustrated in the sense that I feel like there's going to be more policing and enforcing on our communities. My dad's a gardener and we have gardening friends, immigration status, and they're already being harassed by neighbors, just saying, hey, you're not supposed to be using like a gas-powered leaf blower, but in a more mean way. And so these are just things that I think when policy makers are making these laws, to also think about who's going to be affected at the end of the day when making these laws. That's something that my dad is already dealing with. Can you imagine how that's going to be once this thing goes into place? And I think when we talk about environmental justice and inclusivity and really making these laws for the communities who are being impacted, to also have them be part of the table, to be part and also make those decisions for themselves.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point you make. And I say this as somebody who voted for that. It was authored by my colleague who does represent East Palo Alto, Assemblymember Mark Berman, who I just, as a matter of fact, had a conversation with before this one on a little online program I do about this very issue. And what I want to say is we do take into account the impacts across the board, and you have to weigh those things. The environmental and public health aspects outweighed the byproducts negative in my mind. That's why I supported it. But that being said, there are always unintended consequences that you have to be mindful of. That's why we have cleanup legislation. But Mark made the point that he would not have moved that bill had there not been a $60 million fund to help small businesses that rely on that equipment to make the transition to the newer generation electric non-gas leaf blowers. There were some efforts to do enforcement like on a local level, and frankly, that was ineffective. So it really sort of called for a state policy, and the driver really was environmental and public health, and public health of the workers themselves who use these. But the immigration aspect you brought up, it's a good one. Nobody wants to see that kind of enforcement as a result of this law. My hope is that we will track this closely to make sure that those kinds of things are not happening, because that is most certainly not the intent. but we are always mindful of when you make a change, you're going to have impacts potentially on small business. That's why we have money to help these small business folks make that transition. But I appreciate the comment, and I would appreciate if you can monitor this. It goes into effect in 2024. So there's a sort of a slow kind of phase in here. There will be more sort of pressure to produce these the electric leaf blowers. So if you can monitor that, that's something that I would welcome that input in an ongoing way. I'm in San Mateo. Mark Berman, the author, will be absolutely monitoring it because his name is on the bill. And if you see things happening as a result of this, please alert us, please let us know so we can be mindful of that and take additional action if necessary.
All right, thank you very much, Assemblymember Mullen, for spending more time than we asked you to originally with us. So we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure, and great to talk with all of you, and just thank you. Thank you all for your passion, your commitment to what you do. It makes what we do possible, and just grateful for it and grateful for the audience tonight. And please view me as a friendly, and feel free to contact me with any bill ideas you have, any ways to partner going forward. I would welcome it.
I do want to mention, because you mentioned the housing thing, that the Sierra Club, our chapter, has in fact initiated a roundtable discussion on the jobs housing imbalance, and we're getting a lot of support. So we are trying. We've been tearing our hair out about what to do about it. So to how to create a sustainable city. So we are pulling together a team, and we would love to reach out to your staff to participate if they could.
Absolutely. Welcome in. Thank you all very much. Great to be with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for to watch one of the webinar videos, and this one is specific to federally listed endangered species and the value of marshes. So I will, let's see, get that started. Hold on. Oops, hold it. Trying to find my email. Sorry.
That was a great talk by
Yes, it was.
Assemblymember Mullen.
Can you guys see this?
No,
No?
not yet. Not yet.
Okay, let me try that again.
And he, by the way, is the one who has initiated a lot of the legislation for sea level rise.
Okay, I think this is working.
Next
we've
up,
seen
we have Valerie
something.
Bloom from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In 2019, she joined the San Francisco Bay Delta Field Office and serves as the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team member from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for that, James. And yeah, as James noted, I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the San Francisco Bay Delta office in Sacramento. And so we've heard from a lot of speakers today and will over the next couple of days, speaking on a variation of the theme of how important our San Francisco estuary is and how important it is that we need to adapt to climate change. I was asked to speak about the value of the wetlands to federally listed species that were listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. But first, a little about my background. I started out with the state and with several environmental consulting firms. And then, as James noted, I now work for the service. I've been with the service about 20 years now, and recently moved to, I started working for the BRIT. It's a mouthful. It's the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. It's composed of 3 state and 3 federal agencies, and then we have an oversight committee made up of managers from each of those agencies. And EPA is also, as you'll see, their logo is not below. That was an oversight on my part, but they are participating on an ad hoc basis. And the reason for the establishment of the BRIT was to improve the permitting process, to create efficiencies so that for these multi-benefit restoration projects, including those with flood management elements and public access infrastructure. And it covers the whole 9 Bay Area County that rings the Bay. We work mainly on Measure AA projects, or those that are eligible for Measure AA funding, the initiative that was passed in 2016. Someone mentioned that earlier. And the idea behind, again, our establishment was to increase efficiencies in the permitting process. So we're held to the same, the projects are held to the same mandates that if you didn't go through the BRIT process, but we focus on early collaboration, pre-application. And so there's early and often coordination, and we can head off those conflicts that may arise later in the process. And all of this complements 2 new state initiatives I'll mention briefly later in the presentation. So you've seen these figures already, or some version of them, and we'll probably see them over the next couple of days, but it's a good reminder that on the left, this is looking at about the year 1800 and the establishment of, or the presence of tidal marsh in green there. And then you can see on the right, showing the present in 2009 anyway, not a lot of green. So we've had a drastic reduction in tidal marsh habitats in the Bay. And that was mainly from urbanization of the area, conversion to agriculture, and development of industrial and residential areas. And it did bring economic success to the area, but also came at a huge loss. And, you know, in the middle, I realize you can't read the fine print on that, but as others have said, and as Patty enumerated, the sea level rise projections, 3 of them are shown here, different gas emission scenarios. And the point is that none of them are good. We're looking at 1 meter to 1.5 meters or more by 2100. And so that has caused up to 90% loss of tidal marsh habitat in the Bay. So out of that came out of the knowledge of this huge loss of habitat and other functions in the Bay that I'll get to in a minute, the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas that Julie presented in 2019 was published, and this quote I thought was very poignant, and it said, as the climate continues to change, San Francisco Bay shoreline communities will need to adapt in order to build social and ecological resilience to rising sea levels. And then even more pointed down below from the Bayland Ecosystem Habitat Goals Science Update in 2015, stating, you know, calling out the year 2030, that tidal marshes that are established by 2030 are more likely to provide ongoing benefits when sea level rise accelerates at mid-century. And so to do that, the planning, permitting, and construction of restoration projects must be accelerated. Because this guy can't get any higher in the pickleweed over here. Let's see. So what are those functions that tidal marshes provide and that we lost and need to retain? And why do we need to retain those marshes moving forward? Well, because of the services that have already been discussed in detail by others, water filtration and purification, which Christina Toms is on next, I believe, and she's very knowledgeable. This is her wheelhouse, so will be good to hear from her on that. And then, you know, tidal marshes present lots of opportunities for recreation in the bay, hiking, biking, fishing, bird watching, and then the flood control, natural flood control and protection services that a tidal marsh provides. We really need to manage those appropriately so that we can protect our communities. And then nutrient cycling, which Patty spoke to also, is an important function of the tidal marsh. And then what I'm here to talk about today, which is the wildlife habitat benefits of protecting and maintaining tidal marsh around the bay. You know, it does support, the tidal marsh does support so many native species and non-native, unfortunately. But I'm here to talk about the endangered species that are supported. And these are species in this slide that are very dependent on the tidal marsh. I should mention that there are others like California least tern and Delta smelt and Western snowy plover and others that are federally listed under the Endangered Species Act, but and use tidal marsh to some extent during their life cycle, but these are really extremely dependent on the tidal marsh. And here's a summary of the threats that exist to their survival and that caused them to be listed in the first place in the 70s into the 80s. So habitat loss from development that we've talked about a lot now, and including the freshwater discharges that change the salinity regime can affect these species as well. And all that development has fragmented the populations and the distribution of populations. And that is key, that connectivity of these populations is really key to their survival. We've talked a lot about sea level rise that obviously has degraded and caused the loss completely of habitat for these species. Also with development came increased predation pressure. You bring people, that brings trash to an area, and things like raccoons and gulls just explode in population when you have that. A lot of the levees that were put in can be predator highways that in the two species here on this slide seem to be delicious to predators like that. So that has had a major effect in the bay. And then with development came movement of plant species, and we've had non-native plant species invasions to contend with too. So what do the species need to survive and to thrive? Well, they need amelioration of the threats just listed. But in particular, cover is huge for the animal species. And they need that. You know, with the development around the bay, we're already working with such a narrow band at that high marsh upland ecotone. And so with sea level rise, just makes the point even clearer that these species really need restoration to put back that high tide refugia, either at that ecotone with the uplands or on the marsh plain in terms of, you know, adding some topography, we call them Marsh Mounds, for the species to escape into and hide from predators. They also need foraging lands with properly functioning hydrology so that they drain and they can forage on the mud flats and the tidal sloughs. They need, for nesting, relatively undisturbed areas, and that can be a challenge in places developed as the bay. Again, they need a lack of predators or relative lack of predators. And then as far as that last bullet is not showing for me, sorry. They need wide and deep marshes. And by deep, I mean from the upland ecotone to open water, deep that way, not depth of the water. And then wide, because that decreases that edge effect from development. And the more complex the channel system is, the better. The more sinuous the channels and more places basically to hide for these species, the better. And then microhabitats, it's important to preserve the microhabitats, especially the listed plants along the right side of this slide. They really rely on very specific components of the tidal marsh, primarily at the upper marsh band. And so we need to remember when we're doing restoration to incorporate those elements into restoration. And then, so besides that we have to, per Endangered Species Act and other regulations, why should we care about the species? And, you know, for this one, if you asked 50 people, you'd probably get 50 answers. But to me, having those species present on the landscape indicates that the system is working, that it's fully functional, healthy, and it's benefiting everyone. Everyone's probably heard of the canary in the coal mine analogy. These species can be and are the early indicators of the health of our ecosystem and of the bay, to even the human occupants. So we can you know, get an early indication that something's off, something's wrong. And in fact, we have seen those indicators for a while. And then finally, having the species present indicates a biodiverse landscape. And when you've got biodiversity, you've got resilience. And so the more resilient we are moving into existential threats like climate change, the better we all are, including the human occupants. So, and then finally, a quote that I like, which is, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering, by Aldo Leopold. And I should mention, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back, that it's not just that these species are native. I think Julian spoke to that. So there's so many native species, and especially tidal marsh birds, that rely on the San Francisco estuary. They're not just native, but they're endemic. And so it's, you know, there's something to be said that the communities that live around San Francisco Bay can hold these up as symbols of the health of their environment and kind of mascots. We come back to the quote here from the Baygu, we call it the Baygu document in 2015, and that's that by 2030, we really need to keep that siren call present in our minds, because we need to get these tidal marshes established by then. And marshes can take a while, decades sometimes, to fully establish. So we really need to accelerate the funding and streamline the implementation of projects that restore the baylands to tidal action. And that's something that the BRIT team that I'm on is really working hard toward, because restoration really does mean huge wins for the species and human occupants of the bay. And so there are many, or there's a handful at least of really comprehensive restoration guiding documents in the bay right now. And for the Fish and Wildlife Service, this is our guiding document. It's the Recovery Plan for Tidal Marsh Ecosystems of Northern and Central California. It was published in 2013, and it is available online. I think later I have the link listed. So like all recovery plans, it is voluntary. It's not a regulatory document. And the benefit of that is that anybody can participate, and I'll circle around to that in a minute. If you pull up the plan that's available online, you can see that it's broken down into these basic elements. There's an introduction to the ecosystem, tidal marsh ecosystem, and then you know, we go into some detail on the threats that cause the species to be listed initially under the Endangered Species Act. And then we go into more detail on the natural history and what these species actually need to survive and to recover to previous population levels. We set out Baywide, regional, and local recovery strategies, so kind of a three-tiered approach. And that is the strategy is kind of how we will get at recovering the species. And then we have quantitative recovery criteria per species to say, what does it look like when you get to that point? And then we also have time and cost estimates included in there. And then a major component of this I'll circle back around to is the table in the back of the document talks about very specific recovery actions that can be undertaken by any number of organizations or individuals. And that's a real important component of that. The overarching strategies of the recovery plan are, to acquire and protect lands around the bay, the restoration and management of those lands. And it also includes very specific maps as to where restoration could occur. And kind of like the Adaptation Atlas, it's a menu of options. It's in this case, not necessarily true that land has to be restored right here to this habitat type in order for the species to recover, but it's something to think about and something to a menu to shoot for, to pull from. Also, species surveys and monitoring. That is a major component of the strategy. We need to know where we are in reaching our goal. And then research that's required for each of the species and habitats. And then a really important element, which is the coordination and outreach to the community, because nothing like this happens with one single person or organization. And along those lines, right after publication of the document, we put together a recovery implementation team called a RIT. Many of you are familiar with that. It's comprised of invited members, and it's broken into 3 working groups, 2 for each of the animal species and 1 for the plants. And they are in fact working now, and have been even prior to these people and others, have been working on implementation in the Bay that can lead to recovery, move the needle of recovery for these species. And whether it's a small restoration project, a community-based activity, or a policy level action, the work has already started, but there's so much more work to be done, and all organizations and individuals can participate, and you can participate in some way. And so here's a link to the Tidal Marsh Recovery Plan. I know it's kind of a long link. And technically, my coworker, Steve Detweiler, is the division chief. So he's technically in charge of the recovery plan and its implementation team. So if you have questions, it should go to him, but I've got his contact information here at the bottom of the screen. Let's see. One important thing about the recovery plan and having actions listed, specific actions listed, is that folks have told us it helps to leverage funds in other places that it's listed here, in the back of the document. And so what folks can do is, again, that implementation table in the back, is they can flip to the back, say you're in a particular region of the Bay and you've got discretionary funds to use. You can really just flip to your area in the table in the back of the recovery plan and figure out an action that you'd like to fund or be a part of. So very user-friendly. And, in the theme of partnerships, here's a selection of types of partners that we work with regularly, at least on the BRIT. It's not exhaustive. The point is that there are so many passionate organizations working toward the goal of a healthy bay. Point Blue and so many others know this intimately, but we're working now on compiling the data and getting it usable, learning from past restoration projects, standardizing monitoring protocols that help us survey those species in a standard way that can be compared year over year. And then we're using that, and they're developing other tools to help us achieve that goal. And so we really want to learn from past restoration in order to improve restorations moving forward. And as has been noted, these nature-based solutions are just being implemented as part of all projects now, as far as I know. Living shorelines, barrier beaches, ecotone levees or horizontal levees, eelgrass restoration, and beneficial reuse of sediment, along with oyster beds and so many other design approaches that are more natural and, will in the end probably be cheaper than the traditional ways of of doing resilience projects. And they really work with the natural forces. So I'm so excited to see those and to be working on them through the BRIT. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple state initiatives that the BRIT really complements, one of them being the Cutting the Green Tape initiative, and then the other, the California 30 by 30, which is even more recent, and it's the initiative to protect 30% of the state's waters and lands by 2030. So it really ties in well with this. As Julian mentioned, we're seeing restoration successes on the landscape in several areas now that there's been, you know, in some cases, decades of data coming through. One in particular is at Sonoma Creek. It's also part of the refuge. And that was just a few years ago. They did a restoration project there where they let in the tidal flows, restored the fully functional flows, and they built an ecotone, and California Ridgeways Rail were not there previously and have been cited in recent years. So it's really, really exciting to me. In essence, this all to say, these efforts have to be done as a whole. It takes all of us and these major partnerships to get this work done, and we have to be adaptive while we're doing it. So that's really it, aside from some takeaways, to please spread the word about the value of wetlands. Tell your friends and neighbors about the sensitive species that are living in your area, in the places where you love to go, and their needs. Share their needs, those species needs. Volunteer with your ongoing restoration initiatives in your community, and support your local legislature on bay conservation issues. This is the link to the BRIT's webpage and my contact information. You can feel free to contact me anytime with questions about federally listed species, and I'll be hanging around for the panel, and I really appreciate being invited to speak today. Thank you.
Next up is Christina Toms, who is an ecological engineer and senior scientist with the San Francisco Bay.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for. And one thing I thought about when we were watching this is that we've missed showing some of the webinar videos just because I think there's a more important stuff to cover, and speakers that we had, excellent speakers. So what I would like to do is I'm going to send a revised calendar, because what I've done is I've put all the links to the webinar videos in that calendar. And I would really recommend, especially watching the one that we missed last week on carbon sequestration by Patty Oikawa. Was really excellent. There's another one on beaches that we won't have time to look at tonight, but that's worth watching. And then hopefully next week we'll be able to see one on oyster beds and eelgrass, a short video on that. But just a reminder also, next week is our third and final case study on Mare Island. So that will be interesting. And we are trying to open the outing to all those people that are interested. So if you haven't signed up and you're interested, please do that. And I think that's it for tonight. So any last questions or comments by anyone?
Sure.
Hi. Hi.
I'll mute myself.
Thumbs up. Okay.
All right.
Go, Myrna. Go.
Oh, okay. Just very quickly. I think that the response is going to be great at October 30, 10 o'clock to 11:30. You know who my one extra Sierra Club certified outing leader. We know we have one confirmed, and we'd really love to be able to handle a greater number of people. That's all. Put your thinking caps on. Think about who you might know.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I do want to encourage everyone once again to think about the Point Molate project. It's really, really amazingly exciting as an opportunity.
Yes.
It really is true that there are a lot of multi-storied condominium projects, and I have friends and family that live in them. And I can just see that coming in and taking over the whole of Point Malate. And what it can be is somewhat similar to what Myrna Hayes is going to be showing us on Mare Island. It's just an opportunity for people to get up close to the bay in a way that's beautiful and healthy and meditative. And we've got to make it happen. That's the bottom line, is we've got to make it happen. So let's each of us think of it just as a small drop, put your own little bit to work, send it in, and the East Bay Regional Park needs to see a copy. And I think, Susan, would you mind if you send around the addresses again?
Yeah, I
just
can
to
do that.
encourage us all to do that.
Yeah, I can do
That
that.
would be wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to next week. All right. Well, take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.